Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Saskia Lavrijssen. This is my colleague Thomas Kohlbacher. We are from Tilburg University and especially from the Tilburg Law and Economics Center. And together we worked on a research on EU electricity codes and good governance principles. And today we will highlight a bit of the issues that we discussed in this paper. First, I would like to tell you a bit about the origin of this paper. Well, we did this together with the Dutch Association for Energy and Water in the Netherlands, which is a representative organization for large energy users in the Netherlands. And this organization also represents the interests of the energy users at the national and the EU level. And they're also heavily involved in the EU network code process. So we were talking with them about the ways that stakeholder consultation takes place in these procedures, and especially also about the way this could be improved. So the main issue of this lecture will be how did the governance in the EU energy sector develop, especially regarding the development of electricity codes that govern the access to the transmission grids in the energy market. But also, what is the role of the stakeholder participation in this process? And we will especially focus on that and more specifically at the question if stakeholders have given their feedback, to what extent are the different actors in the network of networks for developing the codes responsive to them? Can they be held accountable? And are there possible gaps in accountability regarding the responsiveness to the stakeholders? And then we think of all types of stakeholders, but consumers organizations, network users. Before we start in looking at the procedures and the way this process has evolved, it's just good to highlight what do we mean with good governance. And we refer back to the white paper of the European Commission on governance in the EU. And we see there that the concept of governance relates to the way powers are exercised at the EU level, and especially in a way which is not like the traditional way of exercising powers at the EU level, but more on the basis of networks in which there is an interaction between different levels, EU and national level, regional levels, and there's an involvement of private and public bodies in the creations of formal or informal rules. And governance especially relates to these new ways of making laws and rules in the EU. And whereas the traditional community methods only applicable to this way of governance to a limited extent or only to a part of the powers that are exercised, for the other powers that are formal, that are exercised outside of the community methods, we think it's important that they also relate to the values that should be promoted by the EU, like the rule of law and democracy. And we see that these principles like participation, independence, transparency, and accountability are principles that help to promote the values of the rule of law and democracy beyond powers that are beyond the traditional community method, but also for powers that are exercised in a more network structure. So this is for us the normative frame, these good governance principles, and we also have to view that a large part of these principles relate to general principles of EU law. So in one way or in the other, they can also be related to legal principles and could have legally binding force. In the energy sector, we can talk of governance because there we will have new ways of developing rules for integrating the energy market, and they have the characteristics of the regulatory networks, as we have seen in the literature on networks like of Bursell, Tintani, and Kuhn and Thatcher. As we will explain later on, to see that within the EU network governance in the energy sector, we see that there are different actors from different institutional levels. There are different actors from the private and public sector that are involved in rulemaking that in the end can lead to binding decisions. And there's also a shift of powers from these established institutions to new actors. And there's also a lot of informal rulemaking in these processes, for instance, by recommendations and advices. So these are different characteristics of the network process in the EU energy sector, and we would like to see to what extent these different steps in this network process relate to the governance principles. Before we can describe clearly what happens in the realization of the network codes, we first have to go back to where do we come from, and we see that the energy sector was liberalized as of the 90s, and then we started with liberalization directives that especially wanted to abolish the monopolies in the member states and wanted to guarantee access, market access across the different member states. But it became apparent that that was not enough for achieving a true internal energy market. So, in addition to the liberalization and the unbundling requirements, more and more regulation was introduced. Uh, Institutions had to be created like national regulators. The role of existing institutions changed, and there were more coordination fora between national bodies to help to develop uh, rules for cross-border activities in the energy sectors. So it became apparent that there was a different structure needed to really make sure that the internal energy market can be achieved. So the institutional paradigm shifted from the community method to network governance, as is said by Henscher and Lavrijssen in 2011. If we look back at the first energy package, there was only very limited, there were limited provisions on institutions in the energy sector. There was a requirement that a national authority was designated independent of the market parties, which should settle disputes concerning terms and conditions of access to the electricity grids, and appropriate and efficient mechanisms for regulation had to be created to avoid abuse uh, of a dominant position. But there was a large discretion for the member states to design the way regulation should be exercised at the national levels. In many member states, uh, regulatory authorities were created in addition to the competition authorities because the energy market needed some different rules than the application of ex post competition law. Already in the second stage of the energy market of the energy market liberalization of the EU, it became apparent that there had to be more rules on the institutions in the energy market, and now member states were really required to designate an independent national regulatory authority that had to be independent from the rest of the administration that hold also financial interests in the market parties. So new bodies were created and also with powers, ex ante regulatory powers, and these later morphed into the competences of the network development process. Also, as we will tell you later, there was more coordination between the national authorities across the member states. And in the latest package, the third energy package, the institutionalization was further harmonized. The national authorities had to be independent, both politically and from the market parties, and also a new agency was created, the agency of the cooperation between the energy regulators. So there were new mechanisms also raising new questions about transparency and accountability. So we see that the same phases are seen in the Europeanization of the cooperation between the national authorities, In the first package, there was especially some informal cooperation between different bodies, ministries, regulators, TSOs, the commissions, in the Florence form of regulation. This was an informal forum in which informal rules were made on cross-border trade, congestion management, transparency, and tariff principles. But in the end, these principles were not binding, though they could have some effect in national practice because national authorities referred to them and even also some courts did. But this Florence Forum could not be very effective because it had a very diverse membership and it did not have binding powers. So gradually, the EU legislator took more steps to harmonize the cooperation between the national authorities. So in the second package, there was in the directives an actually binding duty for the regulators to cooperate with each other, and there was also a basis for a Commission decision to create the European network of European energy regulators. And this network had some powers to advise the Commission and to coordinate the decisions of the national authorities. But still, this group, though it did good work, did not have binding powers. It did not have enforcement powers, and it lacked the decisions lacked legally binding force. Um, so it was mainly soft power, and the authorities, part of the network, had to decide on the basis of consensus. So things did not go as smoothly as was needed for the integration of the energy market. So in the end, it seems that more coordination was needed at the EU level. It was not enough to have a European regulatory network, but there should be something more. There was more coordination needed, and in the end, there was some compromise by the creation of an EU agency in which also the national authorities were represented. So that led to the creation of ACER, the Agency of the Cooperation Between Energy Regulators, which as the main decision-making body is the regulatory board of the ACER. So this is an independent agency with own legal personality and has some powers to decide in some issues and to coordinate between the national regulatory authorities. So the main tasks of the ACER are in the regulation on ACER, and it has to assist the regulatory authorities concerning common rules for the internal energy market in exercising at the community level the regulatory tasks performed in the member states and where necessary to coordinate their action. The cooperation between the NRAs was put in a formal community structure with clear competences and a power to adopt individual regulatory decisions in some cases. So there is a task concerning the administration of existing norms, but also, importantly, which we will discuss today, is concerning the drafting of technical rules. So one part of the tasks is related at promotion of regulatory convergence, so they can take legally binding decisions in case of cross-border conflict, for instance. Strictly, the ACER does not have enforcement powers, but in some cases it can decide in specific cross-border decisions how NRAs should decide. And secondly, there is very important is that within the board of regulators, the ACER delivers an important input into the network codes, and the network codes are the binding rules for the cross-border electricity grid. And as we will describe in more detail, these are very important binding rules. Reading to new issues, as the ACER itself is also partly independent, the regulators are independent, and they take part of a new network process in which these network codes are developed and which also generate new legal effects for the market parties and for the transmission operators. Very important is that the ACER is independent, but also that the decisions are taken by majority voting so that more progress can be achieved in deciding on new rules. In addition to the ACER and its involvement in the network code development process, also the transmission operators had a new role in the third package. They already played a role in the in the Florence forum, and they had mainly an advisory function, but the third package institutionalized the involvement of the TSOs by establishing the NSOE. And this is an entity with legal personality. It is no EU body, but it has an important role in the network code development process. It has a lot of epistemic authority. It knows a lot about the rules that are needed for the energy market, and therefore, in fact, it has a very large influence on the network code development process, and it develops the draft network codes according to the current state of law. So we will now show a graph, and Thomas Kohlbacher will take over in a few minutes. But we see that the network codes are established by a system of manifold and repeated interactions between the NRAs, the NSOE, and the Commission. It is a complicated process. We will show you a short graph, which will be shortly highlighted by us, and we will go back to the slides later on. Here we have highlighted the process in a graph. And the essence actually is that it's a step-by-step process in which the network codes are actually developed and adopted. And it starts with the European Commission determining the annual priority list on the basis of areas in the regulation. The areas are like the network security and reliability rules or the network connection rules, interoperability rules, and the Commission determines each year which areas are important and in which areas network codes should be developed every period. So the annual priority list is determined by the Commission, and subsequently the ACER then is requested to publish framework guidelines which set clear objectives and principles for the development of the future network code. And these guidelines should contribute to the non-discrimination, effective competition, and the effective functioning of the market. These framework guidelines have to be reviewed by the Commission, and the Commission looks whether they are in line with the annual priority lists, and the ACER also consults with stakeholders about these framework guidelines. And after the establishment of the framework guidelines, the NSOE has to develop the draft network code in line with the framework guidelines. And it does that also after consultations, and also submits a draft to the ACER. The ACER also looks at it and reviews it and consults on it. And finally, the ACER sends the draft proposal to the Commission, and the European Commission finally adopts the network codes after comitology in the current stage, in the current third package, and after the adoption of the clean energy package, it will be possibly adopted via the procedure of delegated acts. So the Commission has the ultimate control over the adoption of the network codes. It will be bound by, it will be adopted as a binding decision, and the Commission will be bound by the principles of good governance and principles of EU law in adopting the final network codes. The network codes are generally binding regulations, so they have legal force in the member states for all the stakeholders and operators that are governed by these regulations. Now, we mainly talked about the pre-comitology phase, so the phase for developing the network codes in which there are manifold interactions. And there, a culture of dialogue between the different stakeholders is of the utmost importance to make sure that the stakeholders are really heard in this process. And in the end, after the adoption of the process of the codes, a new process will start, because then the network codes have to be implemented, and they still leave quite some leeway to be implemented by the NRAs. And the most regulations provide for specific rules for the implementation phase, and the main regulations do not provide clear rules for the implementation of the codes. So these are a very general structure of the main stages of the adoption of the codes. And now Thomas Kohlbacher will take over in assessing the different steps in more detail and for assessing them against the good governance principles.
Right. Thank you very much, Saskia. As Saskia has now discussed already, there is really a system of manifold interactions between the parts of the network. And in order to really get a feeling for the network code development process, it's very important to assess these steps in more detail. So in general, the interactions between the parts of the network can be divided into vertical relationships and horizontal relationships. As regards vertical relationships, we may really see that the precommitology phase consists of a sequence of legal acts of ever-increasing specificity. So as Saskia has already briefly outlined, the regulations of the third energy package include the areas in which network codes can generally be developed. On the basis of these general goals, the Commission issues an annual priority list. On the basis of this annual priority list, Acer develops framework guidelines. Now, these framework guidelines, as Saskia has also already outlined, are then submitted to the Commission, and the Commission assesses whether these framework guidelines are in line with the annual priority list. Therefore, we can say that the Commission exercises a vertical authority over Acer in this sense, so a means of vertical control. Hence, we have a vertical relationship between the Commission and Acer. If the Commission is satisfied that the framework guidelines are in line with the annual priority list, it addresses a request to ENTSO-E to develop draft network codes. These draft network codes are then again assessed by Acer as regards to whether they are in line with the framework guidelines. Hence, in this sense, we could argue that Acer is exercising a means of vertical control over ENTSO-E. Then, in the end, if Acer is satisfied that they're in line with the framework guidelines, the draft network code is then submitted to the Commission and, like Saskia said, then adopted by the Commission currently under Comitology, in future after Lisbon via delegated acts. And here in the Comitology procedure and via delegated acts, again, the legislator exercises some degree of vertical control over the Commission by being able to block the entry into force of the regulation, or by also withdrawing the delegation altogether. But at the same time, as we indicated before, there are also horizontal relationships along the way. So at each step along the way that you see in the slide, there is consultation among the network members, that is between the Commission, Acer, and ENTSO-E, as well as between each body or institution and stakeholders. And these horizontal relationships are provided in great detail via consultation exercises in the third energy package. Now, let us look at these consultation exercises in the pre-comitology phase a bit more closely. In general, Acer and ENTSO-E are obliged to carry out extensive consultations at an early stage with all relevant stakeholders and market participants in an open and transparent manner. However, this general rule is also supplemented by very specific rules. That is, at each step along the way, the legislator provides that consultations may or shall be place or shall take place, or at other instances, also the legislator provides that they take place. Now, it might be a bit beyond the wording of the legislator to say that indeed a different intensity of an obligation to hold consultation exercises was intended. But at least from what we can say is that indeed some consultations have to take place. Then again, of course, there are the rules concerning delegated acts and comitology, where additional consultations are provided, and the clean energy package, in addition, also refers to the interinstitutional agreement on better lawmaking. Now, if we quickly look at this graph again that Saskia showed already before, it is a bit beyond the scope of this presentation to really go into very much detail, but as you can see here, and that's at least the purpose of showing this graph here, is that the pre-comitology phase is very densely regulated. There are really a lot of rules, a lot of interactions between the various members of the network, and a lot of consultations that shall take place or may take place. Now, having talked a lot about the pre-comitology phase, let us take a look at the implementation phase of network codes. Now, the first thing that is striking when talking about the implementation phase is that there is a relative scarcity of legal provisions in the third energy package concerning the implementation phase, concerning the governance structure in the implementation phase. As we will shortly see in the graph as well, the dominant role in the implementation phase appears to be played by NSOE. But it should also be said, and like Saskia also outlined already, the implementation phase is really mainly regulated in each network code itself. Now, this could, on the one hand, be due to the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. Each network code regulates a different part of the market, hence, different issues might require different implementation processes to get to the optimal result. But on the other hand, it could also simply be due to the case that, due to the fact that when the third energy package was adopted, such lengthy implementation procedures were simply not foreseen. Therefore, it could also simply be the case that network codes themselves now provide for fill a gap in the regulatory framework by providing their own implementation process. In any case, however, from a good governance point of view, and like Saskia already outlined as well, when we talk about good governance, we're mainly also interested in safeguarding certain interests. So from a point of view of safeguarding interests, we would really require higher ranking legal norms that would also ensure that in future network codes, certain interests are represented and taken care of. If we now again look at the implementation phase, just to show you briefly, here is the adoption via comitology, and everything below is the implementation phase of network codes. Now, as you see as well here, they are relatively densely regulated. However, most of these rules come from the specific network codes themselves. And in our case, we show you the implementation phase according to CACM, capacity allocation and congestion management. And according to the legal norms that you see in each box, really most of these provisions come from the network code themselves. And we argue that this creates problems from the safeguarding point of view with respect to good governance. Now, let us look at the normative framework for the assessment of network codes a bit more closely. As Saskia has outlined already, we discussed good governance principles of accountability, openness, transparency, independence, and participation. Now, these good governance principles need to be seen together with the general principles of EU law that we have. Why is that the case? On the one hand, good governance principles structure other principles that exist in a legal order around a common core. And on the other hand, good governance principles also gain effectiveness via general principles of EU law. And in particular for network governance, it is of important that good governance principles indeed adapt the specific requirements of these general principles of EU law to the respective needs of network governance. So let us briefly look more closely at these general principles of EU law, just to outline very briefly. Of course, there's first of all the principle of the rule of law, which basically says that authority needs to be exercised within the constraints of law and according to the law. And of course, the principle of the rule of law has various sub-principles. There's on the one hand the principle of legality, the principle of legal and institutional transparency, legitimate expectations, and effective legal protection. Now, just to outline very briefly the principle of legality, in our particular case, means that decisions by an EU body or institutions need to be based on the full consideration of factual and legal considerations of the case, and any improper purpose needs to be avoided. The principle of legitimate expectations means that an individual that trusts in the validity of a given act shall be protected if this expectation is generated by the authority. The principle of effective legal protection, like the principle itself says, requires judicial and legal accountability for acts by EU bodies and institutions. Let us next look at the principle of mutual sincere cooperation. In a nutshell, as has been outlined by the opinion of Advocate General Sharpston, the principle requires that EU bodies and institutions abstain from measures that could jeopardize the attainment of union objectives, and EU bodies and institutions shall also work towards the facilitation of each other's tasks. Finally, next we have the principle of good administration, which is still in a phase of development in the case law of the CJEU. And it has in the past been referred to as also a principle of good, proper, and sound administration. In particular, of particular interest for our case is that it is connected to the principle of the duty of care, which basically means that EU bodies and institutions need to act in a reasoned way. And finally, we have the principle of the institutional balance. The principle of institutional balance has been developed by the ECJ in its judgments, first in Maroni and then in Romano. And it has also evolved over time, just like the institutional framework of the Union has evolved over time with treaty revisions. In its original formulation, it said that discretionary powers may not be delegated. But recently it has been softened and also widened in its applicability. However, the core of the principle has remained the same, which is basically that the consequences of the exercises of authority at EU level cannot differ based on whether authority has been delegated or not. That safeguards that are there for the delegator should also be effective for the delegate. And that means of review that are there for the delegate should also be available for the ultimate act in case of delegation. Now, in its ESMA rulings, the court has decided that indeed within certain boundaries nowadays, the delegation of discretionary powers can take place. However, it has also said that the exercise of the delegated powers needs to be governed by principles that are set in the Delegating Act, and there shall be powers for review as well to take control over the delegate. Now, to outline now briefly the argument or the main argument of the paper. We argued that traditional safeguards, like also Saskia has mentioned already, traditional safeguards in the Union have been designed for the community method, and they're only partially applicable to network governance. Now, since these safeguards are only partially applicable to network governance, this creates a lack of legal accountability. And via this lack of legal accountability, it creates a lack of stakeholder responsiveness. This lack of stakeholder responsiveness creates a lack of accountability, generally speaking. This lack of legal accountability is then insufficiently compensated for by alternative means of accountability, that is political, social, peer, and vertical administrative accountability. And we then also addressed the question whether additional accountability mechanisms can be put in place so that this accountability deficit may be eliminated. And we make a suggestion that if we strengthen the accountability mechanisms via ACER and stakeholder committees, guided by good governance, the governance deficit might be reduced. Now, let us first focus on the Commission's discretion when adopting a network code. According to the principle of legality, as has been discussed above, the Commission needs to take into account the full factual and legal situation that is brought before it. Now, the issue in electricity with the electricity network codes is that ENTSO-E has the epistemic authority, that is, its technical knowledge is really pooled in the network, and it really has the epistemic authority over these technical issues. Therefore, the Commission may only deviate from the draft network code as has been put forward by ENTSO-E if it has supervening expert opinion. And the standard of assessment as to whether the principle of legality has been followed is whether there has been a manifest error of assessment. That is, whether the evidence relied upon by the Commission is factually accurate, reliable, and consistent, and contains all the information that has been brought towards the Commission. So the principle of legality really provides a constraint within which the Commission has to exercise its discretion when adopting a network code. However, moreover, also the principle of legitimate expectations constrains the Commission insofar as legitimate expectations might be created for stakeholders in the pre-commitology phase, and that certain legitimate interests might be taken into account in the network code itself. And finally, the principle of mutual sincere cooperation, as we have discussed above, that means that that EU bodies and institutions need to work towards a facilitation of each other's task, might also constrain the Commission because, as might be argued, this network process in the pre-comitology phase is part of the conditions for the delegation by the legislator to the Commission, and it is also part of the goals that the legislator has foreseen for the regulation of the energy market. Therefore, the Commission might not satisfy the principle of mutual sincere cooperation if it doesn't take into account certain legitimate interests that have been uttered in the network code development process in consultation exercises. So as we see, there are plenty of constraints, of normative constraints on the Commission when adopting a network code. But a problem that we see is that these normative constraints might not be readily enforced by individual stakeholders. This is due to the fact of the rigid standing criteria for direct action in front of the CJEU. Now, in the future, under the Lisbon procedure, as we discussed before, network codes will be in form of delegated acts. Now, for delegated acts, there's a Lisbon test for the direct standing in front of the CJEU. But this one, these standing criteria in particular require that there's no implementation measure. Now, the CJEU has also already discussed in its case law that it adopts a formalistic approach towards this requirement. And as we saw before also in the graph, many of these network codes indeed include a very specific implementation procedure. Therefore, we cannot expect that that the Lisbon test can be satisfied by applicants according to direct action, according to the Lisbon test. Therefore, applicants are left with the general standing test under Article 263 TFEU. But as we also know, the criteria of direct action and individual concern are very stringent. And it is likely that in many cases, these requirements will not be satisfied by applicants. Therefore, applicants will be left with the procedure under Article 267 TFU. And this is indeed, from a safeguarding point of view and from a good governance point of view, not very satisfying for the stakeholder because, as we've seen above, there's an often very lengthy implementation procedure for network codes. So applicants would have to wait for a significant amount of time to be indeed violated in their legitimate interests to then take the route of legal redress via Article 267. But moreover, via this route of legal redress, applicants might actually not be able to achieve the removal of the network structure itself, which frames the dialogue in the pre-comitology phase. As we saw, there are a lot of soft law acts of ever-increasing specificity above, as we have discussed previously. And at least many of these acts might not be removed via the procedure or by challenging the network code itself via Article 267 TFEU. Now, the second focal point, having now established that the principle of accountability, that legal accountability might not satisfy the standards as required by good governance as regards the Commission's discretion when adopting a network code. Let us next look at the second focal point in our paper, which is the soft law powers of ACER and NSOE. Now, NSOE is itself not a body of the EU. It is an international non-profit organization under Belgian law. And as we know from Article 263, TFEU only acts by EU institutions, bodies, agencies, or offices are reviewable under Article 263 TFEU. Hence, there's also no avenue of direct legal redress available to stakeholders as regards the acts of NSOE. Second, as regards the acts of ACER, we may see that legal acts are reviewable under Article 263 1 TFU only if they're intended to produce legal effects vis-a-vis third parties. Now, as regards ACER's opinions and recommendations, they are expressly excluded. As regards procedural rules that ACER issues, they themselves state that they are non-binding, even though they actually regulate for ACER quite a lot of their consultation exercises. And finally, a framework the guidelines are only a part of the information that has to be taken into account by the Commission according to the principle of legality, but they are themselves not intended primarily to produce legal effects vis-a-vis third parties. Therefore, also regarding the soft law powers of NSOE and ACER, we do not have sufficient avenues of legal accountability that are open to stakeholders. Now, as has been discussed, we then look at whether additional or alternative accountability mechanisms such as peer, social, political, and vertical administrative accountability might compensate for the lack of legal accountability. Now, let's look at each of these alternative accountability mechanisms a bit more closely. Now, in our article, we really look for stakeholder responsiveness as part of accountability. So let's look at peer accountability between ACER and NSOE. As we saw before, NSOE and ACER really interact in vertical and horizontal ways in the pre-comitology phase. Therefore, we might expect that this interaction might have constraining force upon each other. And but however, even if we accept that this is true, there is no guarantee that indeed the incentive structure of ACER and NSOE will be such that it will sufficiently safeguard stakeholder interests as stakeholders themselves would if they could do so in the pre-comitology phase. Second, let's look at political accountability. Now, the problem with political accountability is that ACER and the NRAs need to satisfy a rather stringent independence requirements. Moreover, political accountability is subject to the formation of majorities in a parliament. And we might not presume that these majorities are formed necessarily only in accordance with stakeholder interests. So we might not presume that indeed political accountability will lead to the same safeguarding of legitimate stakeholder interests as stakeholders would try to safeguard themselves if they could do so in the pre-comitology phase. Finally, as regards social and public accountability, we saw that in the pre-comitology phase, at least, there are many different consultation exercises. So we might presume that indeed ACER and NSOE are constrained by stakeholder consultations, by being answerable to stakeholders throughout the process and being subject to their criticism. However, also, as we said just in the previous couple of slides, there are insufficient safeguards for stakeholders in order to hold ACER and NSOE into account. So there are no guarantees for stakeholders that indeed, once uttered, ACER and NSOE will take legitimate interests into account. Now, and finally, if we look at vertical administrative accountability, again, we see that independence requirements might hamper these kind of accountability mechanisms. So therefore, we can really see that alternative accountability mechanisms do not sufficiently complement the lack of legal accountability. So just to summarize the argument, the lack of legal accountability mechanisms is due to stringent standing criteria in front of the CJEU, even though there would be apparently sufficient normative constraints on the Commission and also ACER and NSOE. And second, the lack of legal accountability is due to the non-reviewability of the acts of ACER and NSOE. Now, as we also saw, alternative accountability mechanisms are insufficient to compensate for this lack of legal accountability mechanisms. And the lack of accountability overall then also leads to a lack of participation, that is, meaningful participation by stakeholders, including a way for stakeholders to then hold the respective body or institution into account if that body or institution does not follow the stakeholder interests. This overall then leads to a lack of good governance in a network code development process. However, we also discussed in the paper that good governance principles may then guide the search for alternative accountability mechanisms based on for the specific case of network governance. And this is a very important point, and I think Saskia has also highlighted this already. Since we exercise authority in the regulation of the energy market, not according to mechanisms of the community method, it is not a future way for improving good governance to indeed try to expand the accountability mechanisms as they would exist for the purpose of the community method. We really need to look at alternative accountability mechanisms. And here we make two suggestions. On the one hand, we suggest a stronger role for stakeholder committees. Now, stakeholder committees already structure the participation of stakeholders in the process, but they do so in an informal way. And what we suggest, and what Saskia will also elaborate a bit further still, is that the formalization of the role of stakeholders might make stakeholder committees really part of the governance structure as it is foreseen in the regulations of the third or fourth energy package. And therefore, also this might give stakeholders an opportunity to then voice their disconcern if their legitimate interests have not been properly taken into account. This would then again have the effect that their disconcern might become or would become part of the factual and legal situation that the Commission has to take into account, which then again provides an additional constraint on the Commission when adopting a network code. Second, what we would argue for is that the role of ACER could be expanded to the implementation phase. And of course, we mean so in a safeguarding way. So really, this role should be expanded at the level of the regulations of the third or then the fourth energy package in order to really have ACER have a European voice in the implementation of network codes. But I will now give the microphone back to Saskia, and she will summarize this more closely.
Yes, for the sake of time, I will keep this short. But our main argument now is that we've seen that due to the specialities of this procedure, it's difficult for stakeholders to enforce that there is responsiveness to their feedback. But we do not think that we should enlarge the role of the Court of Justice in reviewing, for instance, opinions and recommendations. No, instead, we would like to develop more softer instruments that could enhance the role of stakeholders in the process, like the inclusion of stakeholder committees in the pre-comitology phase. If these committees could make a formal advice regarding the draft network code, and they should give, for instance, reasons, or they can give their dissent with some of parts of the draft codes which could go to the Commission, then in the end the Commission should fully consider this advice in adopting the codes after the comitology procedure. So by formalizing the role, it will be more transparent what is the view of the stakeholders via the stakeholders committees, and which also possibly gives them more weight in the final procedures in which these codes are adopted. Mm, so this is proposed, and in the end, also we think it's important that in the implementation phase, the role of the ACER will be enlarged, as this will give further possibilities for the improvement of the accountability in the implementation phase, as now the several NRAs have to consent to the draft implementation measures, and this leads to a lot of problems in holding the authorities accountable, or what happens if one authority does not approve a certain methodology. So by giving ACER a more central role in this final phase, there will be more transparency, and there's more a focal point for stakeholders to give their feedback to. In practice, I think there's still a lot happens. A lot of stakeholder consultations do take place, and they are important. And we know that the ACER and the Commission tries to take into account all those different stakeholder responses. But we think in the end it will be enhanced by these several recommendations that we made. This is the conclusion of this phase of the webinar, and we are open for answering further questions. Here it said, whose interest is not duly taken into account in the pre-implementation phase? Could you provide some examples? Well, we have talked with the Association of Consumers in the Netherlands, and they say that in some instances they give a lot of feedback on the draft codes, and then in the responses some comments are not responded to, or only in a very short way. So with the stakeholders, then the feeling is that their feedback is not duly taken into account. Then lack of legal accountability in the process. How can you make a part that is lagging behind in the process be made responsible? I mean, how can you address inertia or lack of diligence in managing your own tasks? I don't understand this one. The question of Nicolo Rosetto, how can you make a part that's lagging behind in the process be made responsible? I do not really understand the question, so if some clarification can be provided. And then the question, who are the stakeholders? I think association of consumers, network users, DSOs, all users of the networks that are affected by the rules on the grid and the operation of the grid. And you see that there is the group of users that are affected by the codes are getting larger and larger because the codes, the area of that the codes cover are also extending. So now even requirements on connection points can be made, so it can also affect many people.
Yes, I may just quickly answer the question concerning the delay and how we can make the network more responsible, or I suppose it's responsive in case there is a delay. Now, on the one hand, of course, it was a bit too much for the presentation now, but as the graph that we showed also indicates, there are certain safeguards as regards delays. So there are certain alternative procedures. What happens if one part of the network code doesn't deliver its output along the way? So then another body or institution along the way will take over. So there are some rules in the regulations themselves. And of course, otherwise, this is also exactly what we argue for. So indeed, at the moment, there are mainly soft powers that can be exercised. That is via peer accountability or social public accountability, which, however, then again requires some responsiveness, some mechanisms that would ensure the responsiveness for stakeholders. So it is indeed also there. One might also say that there might be a lack of accountability mechanisms that would ensure that there's no delay along the way.
And then a question, do you think a consumer could bring an action in front of the national court for poor implementation of the network code? The national authorities have to consent to large part of the implementation phase of the network code. So in the end, if there is a decision of a national authority, indeed, I think consumers could try to annul a national decision at the national court. But of course, there should be then an actual national decision. And this can also raise some accountability questions because national authorities have to agree to the implementation methodologies for the network codes, and maybe at some national levels, an agreement of a national authority to such implementation methodology may not be seen as an act which you can appeal at the national level. So it may be possible, but because of national administrative law, there may be some hurdles. And I think there also some coordination of the national and EU procedures at the implementation phase could be coordinated. And for instance, in the Netherlands, an ordinary consumer usually cannot appeal a decision of a national authority very easily because he has to show that he has a separate individual interest, which distinguish him from all other consumers. So you have to be special. The guidelines and the codes are both seen as regulations. So from their effect, they are not different. But in principle, the network codes are adopted via a somewhat different procedure, where the guidelines now are adopted via comitology. But in a legal nature, they're not different, to my mind. I also don't think that there's a formal list of stakeholders. And I also think that not all stakeholders that have an interest are involved in the procedures because they don't know or they don't understand what is happening. So the stakeholder responsiveness and representation is also not always that good because stakeholders may not have the sources to have a good voice at the EU level.